be good firewood.
Guillermo del Toro's animated Pinocchio feature won the Best Animated Film Academy Award last year, and it was different from the version we popularly know of from Disney. While Disney wasn't obvious regarding the settling of the story, del Toro's take took Benito Mussolini's fascist regime as the setting of the story. Making these changes made us ponder the story's individual details and how certain things in the original Disney film are pretty dark and never really addressed. Let's look at all these elements of Pinocchio that made it a lot more different than the version of the story we remember from childhood. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Original backstory of Pinocchio. Since we will jump into the original story of our favorite puppet, you should be prepared to hear some fundamental dark aspects that Disney has tried to avoid over the years. Written by Italian author Carlo Collodi, Pinocchio was the story of a puppet and his creator, who was a father figure to him, Geppetto. One might wonder how someone can develop a story like this, but it seems it is based on the author's life. Ever since the story went across the world, it has become a sensation, with people interpreting the elements of the story according to the different political aspects surrounding it. Pinocchio was even associated with the human condition in modern civilization, which makes sense if you get into the trivial details of life. Collodi had a past, and the effects of that past trauma are something that we come across with each of the elements that Pinocchio faces in the story. Growing up in a low-income family with 10 siblings, Collodi's family went through a fair share of tragedies. Most of his siblings died at an early age, with some dying in their infancy, and this pain is something that had a long-lasting impact on him and ended up being a part of his writings. Even though he could never claim his child, who he had with a married woman, Collodi questions whether he related himself to Geppetto. This connection would make Pinocchio the child he never had. The fact that the author experienced some of these losses firsthand makes the story authentic, which is why the story became so popular. Over the years, various interpretations of the story have been put forward to the world, and each has its own story. Doing this makes sense, considering the story's timelessness and how it carries an irony that can be easily put across based on the interpretation. However, fans might still need to remember the original story by Carlo Collodi, as specific details have been changed and twisted to fit a particular audience. But today we will dive into the details and bring out the tiny inferences that have been left out and details that require some serious attention from the story of Pinocchio. For example, in the original story, Jiminy Cricket wasn't Pinocchio's ally for that long. He is killed by Pinocchio around the beginning of the story in a way that almost makes it feel like it's a parody of every interpretation that Disney has ever made. Pinocchio throws a hammer at Jiminy Cricket after being annoyed by the various warning statements he started making. Yes, that was unexpected. Analyzing Pinocchio's allegorical journey through addiction. There has also been a debate about the more significant meaning of a literary piece, a movie, or any such piece. Artist Teresa de Salvio made a version of Pinocchio that indulges in the aspect that affected her the most in the story. She made 34 paintings that dramatize her version of the story, with each painting indicating Pinocchio's slow descent into addiction. Even though she worked on this aspect because she associated it with her son's life, it isn't that far-fetched from the story's original version. Even after removing the darker elements of the character's arc, the modern interpretations also managed to bring the primary arc to life. Characters like Honest John and Stromboli lure Pinocchio towards a path from where getting back could be quite a complex story. As he ends up in Pleasure Island after Honest John suggests he do that, being disguised as a doctor, Pinocchio could have sunk sunk entirely into this addiction, but something happens that forces him to change his ways. When he sees his friend growing hooves and ears of a donkey, Pinocchio realizes that things have gone too far, and he needs to take things seriously and walk away from this. This is a massive parallel here, since the friend could be someone who started suffering due to his addiction, and Pinocchio witnessed it and didn't accept this way of life. Fans might remember watching the characters smoking and drinking in the animated movie, something that will now be removed from a movie right away. Even though there is a sense of this addiction aspect in the story, we can be sure that Walt Disney didn't depict the darker sense of addiction, but he was aiming for elements of temptation and how easily it can influence someone.
Long now.
Deciphering Pinocchio's rush to maturity. Pinocchio undergoes a significant development in the story. It's almost as if he matures quite swiftly based on his variety of experiences. Over time, he realizes the good and the bad as he sees these elements around him and how they have a solid impact on his life, and this forges his morale and leads him to make decisions where he respectfully treats the only person he can trust, Geppetto. The consequences of his action also prove to be a lesson when he lies to the Blue Fairy and his nose starts growing. But honestly, there is a larger construct of the boy being unaware of how the world works. In the Disney animated movie, we see Pinocchio being handed a textbook and an apple by Geppetto to go to school with the other kids. But he would need to be made aware of the concept of a school, other kids, and even the textbook he held. The idea of being innocent makes him easy prey for honest John and Gideon, who lure him into not attending school. However, the consequences of his action and the chance of getting away around the end make him realize that he made the wrong choice initially. This becomes a lesson that institutions like schools would take years to teach kids. Even though experiencing this dark path only to learn the way of life sounds like a scary option, the book and the story use this to teach Pinocchio a lesson and rush the character into maturity. Pinocchio becomes aware of how the world works and whom he can trust.
Oh, Pinocchio! Pinocchio!
Pinocchio's tragic demise in children's cinema. Carlo Collodi's original version of Pinocchio's story was released in serial form under the story of a puppet. But this version was so dark and grim that Disney had to do multiple washes to make it suitable for kids. The original run of the story ended with Pinocchio dying a sad death after being hanged for his errors. But the editor requested Collodi to continue the tale, to which the author made him survive and get an important lesson, thus making him better over time. We should be glad that we didn't have to see the alternate end in the Disney animated films, as it would have been a traumatic experience. Death does come to Pinocchio, but he sacrifices himself to save Geppetto this time. It was the very first death depicted in a Disney film, and it was quite a stark change for the audience to see their protagonist lay dead for a few seconds as his wooden body floats in the ocean. We can be sure kids back then would have been traumatized. Luckily, he gets saved by the Blue Fairy's kiss, which is also the first time that something like that happened. We should be glad that this became a trope used in other Disney movies, where a kiss saves the protagonist and brings them back to life. Darker side of children's storytelling with child trafficking themes. The concept of Pleasure Island could have various meanings based on the things we see around it. When we were kids, we were asked not to get lured by a stranger if he promised to give us chocolate or any other type of candy. Similarly, all the kids were lured and brought to the Pleasure Island by the coachman and his carriage, which was being pulled by several donkeys with the promise of fun and play. Coachman's character is very similar to a child trafficker, as he manages to get hold of these kids, and it works out for him because he never gets caught as the children turn into donkeys. But that might not be the only thing, since we saw with Pinocchio that the children lost their innocence and were traumatized by by their experience. When Geppetto asks Pinocchio about his experience, he doesn't say anything, clearly showing that he doesn't want to talk about his experience. This entire scenario introduces a layer that might impact the viewer immediately, but it can have quite an effect once it does. These elements are put into these scenes in a specific subtle way, which makes them a lot more traumatizing because one has to ponder the narrative to understand its weight. Gruesome revelations. Stromboli's Wagon as a chilling puppet graveyard. Stromboli is one character in the film who is the complete opposite of Geppetto in various aspects. However, the primary element that makes him different from Geppetto is that Geppetto treats his creations like they have life, while Stromboli oppositely treats them. There is a particular macabre look that we get inside his wagon with a variety of puppets hanging around. Upon the first look, one might wonder how colorful it looks, along with the food and everything. But in the corner, one can see puppets hanging from strings attached to the ceiling, giving an ominous feel of being hanged. At the same time, Stromboli plants an axe on an old marionette, which has a smile on its face, and again, that makes it unsettling. It gives the sense that Pinocchio's fate can be the same whenever Stromboli feels like it.
No strings on me.
No strings attached with Pinocchio. Or is it? Remember the song There Are No Strings on Me? Marvel fans might remember when Ultron sang it and when he first appeared in front of the Avengers in the 2015 film. That has to be one of the best uses of the songs other than Pinocchio, since Ultron was trying to indicate that he is no longer under the control of Tony Stark, and he is free now. But when Pinocchio was singing this song, it was about the fact that while the other puppets had strings, Pinocchio didn't. And at the same time, Stromboli felt that the strings were the only means to control Pinocchio, and him not having any made him feel insecure. Pinocchio also fails to understand all those times when the other puppets, the Dutch and French, were trying to flirt with him by saying things like, he has no strings, so he is free to love them. They were trying to indicate that he is single and available. But Pinocchio didn't catch any of this, and instead was flattered by how popular he had become just with this one show.
Boys, right here. Get your cake, pie, dill pickles, and ice cream. Eat all your...
Unsolved Fates, delving into the mystery of Pleasure Island's forgotten victims. Did you know that just like fairy tales inspired the other characters from Shrek films, the donkey also has an interesting origin story? Donkey talks about going to school and makes specific references to his past life, which might mean that he was among the kids who went to the island with Pinocchio and turned into a donkey forever. But then that's just a fan theory, and a talking donkey isn't that surprising, is it? But this makes us wonder about the other kids who visited Pleasure Island with Pinocchio. Maybe all the kids were turned into donkeys and pulled into Coachman's carriage. The idea that they were all put into use could be indicative of child labor, and the fact that all these kids were put into child labor since they thought they could get away from school and have fun. Even Pinocchio, who could stand up for his friends, doesn't do anything and goes ahead and probably lives the happily ever after story.
Little puppet made of pine, wake.
True intentions behind the Blue Fairy's actions. The Blue Fairy was supposed to give life to Pinocchio, but if we look at how she set up this arc, it might show that she was pretty ruthless at times. If a kid lied at any parent, the parent would first put them out of their misery and then scold them. But when the fairy finds him in the cage, she gives him a proper scolding first and then frees him. It might be because not everyone gets to have a fairy to look after them, and he should consider himself lucky. But even then, he is just a child. Even at the end, when Pinocchio has to sacrifice himself to save Geppetto, it feels like that went too far, considering the fairy could have shown him some other way to deal with the situation, because he in turn managed to save himself from the Pleasure Island. Considering that his nose elongated each time he lied, it sounds like a curse to a kid who has just walked into the world.
A real boy, don't you?
Uh-huh.
All right. Sit down, son.
Morally bankrupt? Reassessing Jiminy Cricket's integrity. Jiminy Cricket plays a significant role in this story because he is Pinocchio's guide. Even though Pinocchio hardly listens to him, he ends up being his conscience, and sometimes he behaves awfully to Pinocchio and does not listen to what he has to say. It was visible when Pinocchio went to perform for Stromboli, and Jiminy walked away after failing to convince him not to go through with it. He could have put in more effort to persuade him instead of giving up entirely, as the innocent Pinocchio faced the consequences of his actions. Around the end, when Pinocchio decides to go into the ocean to save Geppetto from the whale, Jiminy tries to talk him out of it. The idea that he doesn't want Pinocchio to go and do this becomes a clear example of a moment where Jiminy wasn't the ideal conscience, even though he was probably just looking out for Pinocchio. Still, the puppet's moral compass gave us the happy ending we got to see. Other than this, Jiminy did exhibit specific characters that don't put him across as an ideal candidate for Pinocchio's conscience, with his smoking and womanizing habits.
There! This will be...
Analyzing the absence of justice for villains in Pinocchio. Throughout the story, we never get to see the wrong people whom Pinocchio comes across getting punished for their actions. They all get away with it, and Pinocchio doesn't do anything about it, even though it doesn't make sense for us to believe he would, as he is just a child. The idea that these villains get away with it represents what happens in society, and it can be pretty scary for kids since they would feel that there is no retribution for them and their acts.
Here's your book.
I'm going to school.
School.
Pinocchio's impactful approach in teaching children about stranger danger, appreciated by adults. Pinocchio learns everything firsthand, which could be traumatic for the character, but it proves to be a lesson for the kids. People who saw it understood the message that it carried. And even though in a much real world, the result would be far more ruthless in comparison to what we saw in Pinocchio's case, there is particular genius to the way the film manages to show us the outcome of being foolish and going for bad choices. As a child who has just come to the world, it can be too harsh, but the way the story shows that there is still a chance to turn things around and do good to save oneself is pretty promising. After all, we get erasers at the end of the pencils because we make mistakes, and they are always there so that we can correct them. Marvelous verdict. Most of the Disney tales were inspired by European stories that had quite a bizarre turn of events compared to the adaptation we saw. Even this, it is surprising how Disney managed to convey a message and bring it to the audience while keeping in mind that the story doesn't get lost in all of that. Another brilliant aspect of these stories is that they can be brought out in various versions with different settings, keeping the basic story the same. Over the years, we have seen this happen with many of these stories, but recently we get to see 3 different takes on the story of Pinocchio released around the same year. The fact that this happened was interesting, considering Disney did make a version that was the live-action adaptation of the animated film. Still, the one that made a difference was Guillermo del Toro's take on the story. His stop-motion feature won the Academy Award, proving how successfully the story can be put into a different context while keeping the idea of the child getting mature with time in hand. In a way, Frankenstein's monster is also a version of Pinocchio, but that can be said for many other stories and concepts. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.